Sometimes the loneliest hearts have the most room left to give. For 20 long years, 65-year-old Silas Wren carried his grief like a stone in his chest, keeping to himself on a dying ranch where dust settled thick on old memories and silence filled every space where laughter used to echo. Then one scorching summer morning, 10 desperate families appeared at his weathered gate, hungry, exhausted, turned away from every single town, holding nothing but threadbare hope, and children who'd long forgotten what home felt like. What happened next wasn't charity, it was resurrection. Could a broken man who'd lost everything teach others how to rebuild, and could complete strangers become the family he never thought he'd have again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun rose over Wren Ranch the way it had for 2 decades, indifferent, relentless, painting the cracked earth in shades of amber and dust. Silas opened his eyes at 5:30, same as always, before the alarm clock had a chance to rattle on the nightstand. His body knew the rhythm, even when his mind wandered through the fog of half-remembered dreams. He lay there for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a horse if you tilted your head just right, and listened to the house settle around him. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he rose, joints protesting in that familiar morning chorus. 65 wasn't old, not really, but 2 decades of hard labor and harder solitude had a way of settling into a man's bones. He pulled on his jeans, the same pair he'd worn yesterday, and the day before that, and walked to the kitchen in his undershirt, feet bare against the cool wood. The kitchen still held traces of a woman's touch, though Sarah had been gone long enough that those traces felt more like ghosts. The blue checkered curtains she'd sewn, the cast-iron skillet she'd seasoned to perfection, the hook by the door where her apron used to hang, empty now, except for his work gloves. Silas filled the coffee pot with water from the pump, measured out grounds with the precision of ritual, and set it on the stove. While the coffee percolated, he walked to the mantel in the living room. There, in a dented tobacco tin that had once belonged to his father, sat a simple gold band, Sarah's wedding ring. He'd put it there the day after the funeral, unable to look at it, but unable to let it go. Every morning for 20 years, he'd opened that tin, held the ring between his thumb and forefinger, felt its weight, and remembered. She'd been 23 when she died. He'd been 28. They'd had 3 years together. 3 years of laughter and plans, and the kind of love that makes you believe the world is kinder than it really is. She'd been 6 months along when the complications started. The midwife had come, then sent for the doctor from 40 miles away, but by the time he'd arrived, it was already too late. Sarah first, bleeding out while squeezing his hand hard enough to leave marks. Then the baby, a girl, perfect and silent, who never drew a single breath. He'd buried them together under the cottonwood tree on the east side of the property, the one with the tire swing he'd hung for children that would never come. For a while, people from town had tried to help, brought casseroles, offered condolences, suggested he move on. But grief isn't something you move on from. It's something you learn to carry, and Silas had decided to carry his alone. The coffee boiled over, hissing against the hot stove, and Silas blinked back to the present. He returned the ring to its tin, closed the lid, and went back to the kitchen. The burned smell of coffee mixed with the dust that seemed to coat everything these days. He poured himself a cup, black, and stood at the window, watching the sun climb higher. The ranch spread out before him like a faded photograph. 200 acres of scrubland and dried creek beds, dotted with mesquite and the occasional stubborn cottonwood. The barn leaned slightly to the left, its red paint long since peeled away to grey wood. The fences sagged in places, held together more by habit than nails. 3 horses stood in the corral, Buck, a 20-year-old quarter horse with a white blaze, Sable, a mare who'd gone grey around the muzzle, and Copperfield, a gelding with one blind eye and a stubborn streak. There was also Martha, a mule who'd outlived 2 owners before Silas, and a small flock of chickens that scratched at the dirt near the coop. He fed them first. as always, carried out hay and grain, checked their water troughs, ran his hands along their flanks, looking for injuries or illness. The animals didn't judge, didn't ask questions, didn't expect him to be anything other than what he was, a man who showed up every day and did the work. After the feeding, he walked the property line. It was something he did most mornings, a patrol that served no real purpose since nothing ever changed. But walking gave him time to think, or rather, time to not think. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and the morning heat was already building toward another scorching day. Beyond the ranch lay Redemption Falls, or what was left of it. Once it had been a proper town general store, saloon, church, schoolhouse, nearly 200 people calling it home. That was back when the railroad had planned to come through, back when people believed in futures and fresh starts. But the railroad chose a different route, and the future dried up along with the creek. People left in a slow bleed, first the young families, then the merchants, finally the old-timers who'd held on out of stubbornness more than hope. Now it was just bones. Empty buildings with broken windows, a church steeple that listed like a drunk, streets where weeds pushed through the hardpan. Silas was the last one left within 10 miles, and sometimes he wondered if he'd stayed out of stubbornness too, or if he'd stayed because leaving would mean admitting that everything he'd built here meant nothing. He'd built plenty, once. Before Sarah, before the ranch, he'd been a different man entirely. Those were the years he didn't talk about, not even to himself if he could help it. Years spent in places that felt very far away from this quiet corner of nowhere. He'd carried a rifle instead of fence posts, taken orders instead of giving them, and done things that seemed necessary at the time, but haunted him now in the small hours before dawn. When he'd come home, he'd wanted something simple, something clean. He'd met Sarah at a church social, married her 4 months later, bought this land with money he'd saved, and believed, really believed that he could leave the past behind and build something good. Then she died, and he'd learned that you can't outrun what you carry inside you. By mid-morning, the heat was oppressive. Silas worked on the fence along the north pasture, replacing posts that didn't really need replacing, stretching wire that was already tight enough. It was make work, the kind of thing you do when you need your hands busy and your mind quiet. Sweat soaked through his shirt and dripped from the brim of his hat. His hands, scarred and calloused, moved with automatic precision. He broke for lunch around noon, leftover beans and a heel of bread, eaten standing at the kitchen counter. No point in setting the table for one, no point in pretending this was anything other than fuel. He drank water straight from the pump, letting it run cold over his head and down his neck. The afternoon stretched out like all the others. He mucked out the barn, sorted through a pile of old tack that probably should have been thrown away years ago, greased the hinges on the chicken coop door. Small tasks, endless tasks, the kind that fill up a day without filling up the emptiness. Around 4, he sat on the porch with a second cup of coffee and watched the shadows lengthen. This was his favorite time of day, though he wouldn't have admitted to having a favorite anything. The worst of the heat had passed, and there was occasionally a breeze that carried the smell of sage and distant rain that never quite arrived. The horses dozed in the corral. The chickens had gone quiet. Even the insects seemed to take a breath before the evening chorus began. He thought about Sarah, because he always thought about Sarah at this hour. She'd loved evenings on the porch, would sit in the rocking chair with her knitting or a book, telling him about her day, even though they'd spent it together. She'd had a way of finding stories in the smallest things, the way a lizard sunned itself on a rock, how the wind made patterns in the dust, what she imagined the clouds might be discussing as they drifted by. He'd loved listening to her. Loved the sound of her voice, the way she'd pause mid-sentence to laugh at her own tangents, how she'd reach over and squeeze his hand for no reason except that she felt like it. In 3 years, she'd taught him how to be soft again after all those hard years. She'd taught him that a man could be strong and gentle at the same time. And then she was gone, and he'd forgotten how to be either. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for a day this ordinary, Silas went back inside. He made a simple dinner, eggs and more beans, a slice of the bread he'd bake fresh on Sunday if he remembered. He ate at the counter again, cleaned his plate, set it in the basin to wash later. He should have gone to bed, should have followed the same routine that would start again in 12 hours. But instead, he walked back to the mantel, opened the tobacco tin, and held Sarah's ring up to the lamplight. "I'm sorry," he said to the empty room. Same as he'd said every night for 20 years. Sorry for not getting the doctor faster. Sorry for not seeing the signs earlier. Sorry for surviving when she didn't. Sorry for building a life that turned out to be a graveyard. The ring caught the light, glinted gold, offered no absolution. He put it back, closed the tin, and stood there in the silence of a house that had forgotten how to be a home. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose board on the barn roof. Tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after that, and all the days that followed, stretching out in an unbroken line of sameness until there were no more days left to count. This was his life now. This was his choice. A man, alone with his grief, his regrets, and 200 acres of dust that nobody wanted. He'd believed, once, that isolation was a kind of penance, that if he stayed here long enough, suffered quietly enough, it might balance some cosmic scale. But scales don't balance. Debts don't get paid. The dead stay dead, and the living just get older. Silas turned off the lamp, climbed the stairs in darkness, and lay down in a bed that had been too big for 20 years. Through the window, he could see stars scattered across the black sky like thrown seed. Sarah used to make wishes on them. He closed his eyes and waited for morning, same as always, expecting nothing different, wanting nothing more than to get through another day without thinking too hard about why. The next morning started the same way every morning started, until it didn't. Silas was at the pump, filling the water troughs, when he heard a sound that didn't belong to the careful silence he'd cultivated. Voices. Multiple voices, carrying on the still air like a distant argument or a prayer. He straightened, water sloshing over his boots, and turned toward the road. At first, he thought it was a mirage. The heat did that sometimes, made you see things that weren't there. But as he squinted into the morning glare, the shapes resolved into something impossible and entirely real. A line of wagons and trucks, maybe 8 or 10 vehicles in all, crawling up the dirt road toward his gate. His first instinct was to go inside, lock the door, pretend he hadn't seen them. 20 years of isolation had taught him that people brought complications, and complications brought pain. But his feet wouldn't move. He stood there, watching them approach, heart beating faster than it had in years. The lead vehicle, a pickup truck that had seen better decades, stopped at the gate. The engine coughed, died, refused to restart. The driver, a man somewhere in his 40s with sun-darkened skin and eyes that had seen too much, climbed out. Behind him, the other vehicle stopped too, and suddenly Silas's empty road was filled with humanity. Children appeared first, tumbling out of truck beds and wagon backs like puppies let loose. They were thin, most of them, with clothes that had been patched and repatched, but their eyes were bright, curious, taking in the ranch with the kind of wonder that only the young can manage. Behind them came the adults, men and women, who moved with the careful economy of people who'd learned to conserve energy, who knew that every step might need to count. The man from the lead truck approached the gate, but didn't open it. That small courtesy, respecting the boundary even in desperation, struck something in Silas's chest. "Morning, sir," the man said. His voice was rough, but respectful. "Name's Daniel Cortez. I know we're not expected anywhere, truth be told." Silas said nothing. His throat felt dry, unused to conversation. Daniel gestured behind him. "That's 10 families in all. 32 people, 14 of them children. We've been on the road 6 weeks now, turned away from every town between here and the California border. Some places run us off with guns. Most just close their doors and pretend they don't see us. What do you want?" Silas found his voice finally, and it came out harder than he'd intended. "Water, if you can spare it. Maybe some shade for the children while we figure out where to go next." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We're not beggars, sir. We've got skills. I'm a carpenter. Jose over there," he pointed to a younger man with a baby on his hip. "He's a mechanic. We've got teachers, a nurse, people who know farming. We're willing to work for whatever you can spare." "There's no work here," Silas said. "I can see that." Daniel's eyes traveled over the sagging barn, the broken fences, the general air of decline. "But there could be. That barn could be fixed. Those fences could be made right. You've got land here that could grow things if someone put the effort in." "I didn't ask for help." "No, sir, you didn't." Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead. Behind him, a woman was trying to comfort a crying baby. An older child sat in the shade of a truck, fanning a younger sibling with a piece of cardboard. "But we're asking for a chance. Just for a few days, a week at most. Time to rest, to get our bearings, to figure out our next move." Silas looked past Daniel at the gathered families. He saw desperation there, yes, but also dignity. These weren't people who'd given up. They were people who'd been beaten down but were still standing, still trying, still hoping that somewhere someone might see them as human beings instead of problems to be solved or ignored. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, caught his eye. She was holding the hand of an even smaller boy, probably her brother. Her dress was too big, obviously handed down, and her shoes were held together with tape. But she smiled at Silas, a gap-toothed smile that carried no guile, no expectation, just the simple friendliness of a child who hadn't yet learned that the world could be cruel. Something shifted in his chest, a tectonic plate moving after 20 years of stillness. He thought about Sarah, thought about the children she'd wanted to fill this ranch with, running through the fields, laughing in the barn, bringing life to all this emptiness. He thought about the baby who'd never drawn breath, never had a chance to smile at anyone the way this little girl was smiling now. He thought about all the years he'd spent punishing himself, as if his suffering could somehow balance the cosmic ledger, as if staying alone and miserable was some form of honor to the dead. But the dead don't want suffering. Sarah wouldn't have wanted this. She would have opened the gate before Daniel finished his first sentence, would have welcomed them in, figured out the details later, believed as she always believed that people helping people was just what you did. Silas looked at Daniel, looked at the families waiting in the heat, looked at that little girl still holding her brother's hand. "The barn," he heard himself say, "it's big enough for most of you. There's a bunkhouse out back that hasn't been used in years, but it's got a roof. Well, water's clean. You can set up in the shade by the cottonwood if you need more space." Daniel's eyes widened. "Sir, we—" "3 rules," Silas interrupted, his voice rough. 1. Nobody goes into the main house. That's mine. 2. You pull your weight. I've got work needs doing, and if you're staying, you're helping. 3. When you leave everything better than you found it. "We can do that," Daniel said quickly. "We can absolutely do that. And it's not a few days," Silas continued, surprised at his own words. "It's as long as it takes. Until you figure out where you're going, until you've got a real plan. But you stay useful, and you stay respectful." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Daniel's voice cracked slightly. Behind him, someone started crying, whether from relief or exhaustion or disbelief, Silas couldn't tell. He turned and walked to the gate, his hands moving on autopilot to unlatch it. The conduit. Metal was hot from the sun, familiar under his palms. He swung it open, and the old hinges screamed in protest, a sound that echoed across the property like a declaration. The families didn't rush in. They came slowly, carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might make the offer disappear. Daniel shook Silas's hand, a firm grip, calloused palm meeting calloused palm, the handshake of men who understood hard work. "You won't regret this," Daniel said. Silas said nothing, because he already regretted it and didn't regret it at all. This was terrifying. This was insane. This was 32 people about to shatter the careful silence he'd built around himself like armor. But that little girl passed by him, still holding her brother's hand, and she looked up and said, "Thank you, Mister. with such earnest sweetness that Silas felt something crack in the vicinity of his heart. He watched them come through the gate, these strangers who were about to become something else entirely. Watched them take in the ranch with eyes that saw not what it was, but what it could be. And for the first time in 20 years, Silas Wren wondered if maybe, just maybe, the same could be said for him. The first night was chaos wrapped in good intentions. Silas showed them the barn, cavernous, dusty, filled with the ghosts of hay bales and equipment that hadn't run in years. The families spread out, claiming corners, hanging blankets for privacy, organizing themselves with the efficiency of people who'd done this before in too many places. They spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish, their voices echoing off the rafters, and Silas retreated to the porch, overwhelmed by the sudden noise after so much silence. He sat there as the sun set, watching lamplight flicker in the barn windows, listening to the sounds of life, children laughing, adults murmuring, someone singing softly in Spanish. It felt wrong and right in equal measure, like wearing someone else's clothes that somehow fit. Daniel approached as darkness fell, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Mr. Wren? Some of the women made extra food. Thought you might be hungry." Silas took the bundle, still warm, smelling of spices he didn't recognize. "Silas, just Silas." "Silas?" Daniel repeated, testing the name. "We're grateful. All of us." "You said that already." Bears repeating. Daniel hesitated, then sat on the porch steps without invitation. "You mind if I ask how long you've been out here alone?" 20 years, Daniel whistled low. "That's a long time to carry your own company." "It's a long time," Silas agreed, not elaborating. They sat in silence for a moment, two men who understood that some things didn't need explaining. Finally, Daniel stood. "Well, we'll try to stay out of your way. And thank you for the water. Some of the children were getting sick from the heat." After he left, Silas unwrapped the cloth and found tortillas filled with beans and meat, and something green he couldn't identify. It was the best meal he'd had in years, though whether that was because of the cooking or because someone had made it for him, he couldn't say. The second day began with the sound of hammers. Silas woke to find Daniel and 3 other men already at work on the barn roof, replacing boards, hammering down loose shingles. Nobody had asked permission. They'd just seen what needed doing and started doing it. Part of him wanted to be angry at the presumption. The larger part was impressed by the initiative. By mid-morning, the ranch had transformed into something unrecognizable. Women were washing clothes at the pump, hanging them on lines strung between posts. Children chased the chickens gently after Martha the mule gave one boy a warning kick. Someone had coaxed life back into the old wood stove in the bunkhouse, and smoke rose from its chimney for the first time in a decade. Rosa Mendez, a woman in her 50s with silver threading through her black hair, approached Silas while he was checking the horse feed. She moved with quiet confidence, the kind that came from managing a household through hard times. "The children need schooling," she said without preamble. "I taught for 20 years before," she gestured vaguely at everything. "Before all this, there's a structure over by the creek that might work as a classroom. Would you object?" "That's the old tool shed," Silas said. "Roof leaks. Jose says he can fix it." She smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who'd learned to find solutions instead of dwelling on problems. "The children have missed too much school already. Every day matters." Silas wanted to say no, wanted to maintain some control over how his land was being used. But he looked at the children playing near the cottonwood tree, dirty, happy, loud, and remembered Sarah talking about opening a school in Redemption Falls. "Fix the roof first," he said. "Can't teach in the rain. There hasn't been rain in 6 weeks. Then you'll have time to fix it before there is." Rosa laughed, a sound like water over stones, and walked away, already organizing the project in her head. The artifact appeared on his porch the 3rd morning, a carved wooden horse, no bigger than his palm, with delicate legs and a flowing mane. It sat on the railing where he'd see it when he came out for coffee, placed with obvious intention. Silas picked it up, felt the smooth wood, noticed the care in every detail. Someone had spent hours on this, working by lamplight probably, getting the proportions exactly right. He turned it over and found initials carved into the base. D.C. Daniel Cortez. He found Daniel replacing posts on the north fence posts Silas had been meaning to fix for months. "You made this?" Silas held up the horse. Daniel straightened, wiped sweat from his forehead. "My father taught me to carve. Said it was important to make something beautiful in a world that could be ugly. Hope you don't mind. Seemed like you might appreciate it. Given." He gestured toward the corral, where Buck, Sable, and Copperfield were watching with mild interest. "It's good work," Silas said. The words felt inadequate. "Real good work. Thank you." Daniel returned to the fence post, tamping dirt around its base. "You know, these posts, they'll last another 20 years if you treat them right. This whole place, it's got good bones. Just needs some attention." Silas looked out over his land, seeing it through Daniel's eyes. The sagging barn that was now standing straighter, the cleared weeds around the bunkhouse, the children playing near the cottonwood tree where Sarah was buried, bringing life to a place that had been a monument to death. "Why were you all turned away?" The question came out before he could stop it. "From the other towns?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Some places said they didn't have resources. Some said they didn't want our kind around. Some just said no and meant go away." He looked at Silas directly. "We're not criminals. We're not lazy. We're just people who lost everything when the drought hit, when the work dried up, when the world decided we didn't matter anymore. We're trying to find somewhere that will let us prove we're worth keeping around." "You don't have to prove anything to me," Silas said quietly. "Don't we?" Daniel asked, not unkindly. "You let us in, Silas, and we're grateful. But gratitude isn't the same as trust, and trust has to be earned." That night, Silas sat on his porch with the carved horse in his hand and listened to the sounds of other people's lives. Someone was playing guitar in the barn. Children were laughing. A couple argued quietly, made up, laughed together. It was the sound of community, of family, of all the things he'd deliberately shut out. He thought about Sarah's ring in its tobacco tin, about how he'd been holding on to grief like it was something precious instead of something that was slowly poisoning him. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe this place had good bones. Maybe so did he, underneath all the rust and regret. He set the carved horse on the porch railing, where he'd see it every morning, a reminder that beauty could exist even in ugly times, that skilled hands could create something worth keeping. Then he went inside, climbed the stairs to his bedroom, and for the first time in 20 years, he fell asleep to the sound of other people's voices instead of his own silence. By the end of the first week, Silas had learned everyone's names, though he pretended he hadn't. There was Daniel and his wife Maria, who had eyes that could see straight through any lie. Their son Miguel, 16, and trying hard to be a man. Jose and Carmen, with their baby Elena, who cried at night loud enough to carry across the property. The little girl who'd smiled at him that first day was named Anna, and she was indeed watching over her younger brother Tomas, whose lungs were weak from too much dust and too little rest. Then there were the Martinez family, the Hernandez family, the Garcias, the Riveras, each with their own stories of loss and resilience, each contributing something to the collective effort of rebuilding this corner of nowhere into something that could sustain life again. They'd fallen into routines without anyone declaring how things should work. The women handled the cooking and the washing, though Silas noticed Rosa teaching the teenage boys alongside the younger children in the converted toolshed. The men worked the land, fixing what was broken, improving what had been neglected, planning what could be grown when the seasons turned. Everyone over the age of 12 had a job, even if it was just watching the younger children or feeding the chickens. Silas found himself drawn into their rhythm, despite his intentions to remain separate. He showed José where the well pump mechanism was finicky, demonstrated for Daniel how the barn door needed to be lifted slightly when opening. Small contributions, but they were contributions, and they mattered. The second artifact appeared on a Sunday morning church day, apparently, though Silas had forgotten such things existed. Rosa had organized a service in the shade of the cottonwood tree, using an old crate as a pulpit and singing hymns in Spanish that Silas couldn't understand but felt in his chest anyway. He watched from the porch, not joining but not turning away either, and afterward he found something new on the railing beside the carved horse. A rosary. Not the fancy kind with gold or silver, but simple wooden beads strung on sturdy thread, worn smooth by years of faithful hands. Attached to it was a note in careful handwriting, "Para protección y paz," for protection and peace, from Rosa. He held it up to the sunlight, watched the beads catch and scatter the brightness. He wasn't a religious man, hadn't been since Sarah and the baby died, and he'd decided that any god who would allow such things wasn't worth talking to. But the gesture touched him anyway, this offering of something precious, given freely with no expectation of conversion or reciprocation. Rosa found him still holding it an hour later. "I hope I didn't overstep," she said, "but I noticed you have no crosses, no saints, nothing that speaks of faith. And I thought perhaps you used to. Perhaps you put them away when things got hard." "Something like that," Silas admitted. "Faith isn't about understanding why bad things happen," Rosa said, settling into the chair beside him without asking, which he was starting to realize was just how these people operated. "It's about believing there's still goodness worth reaching for, even when everything tells you to give up. And if you can't believe that, then you hold on to the rosary, and you let someone else believe for you until you're ready to try again." She smiled, that same calm smile that probably helped her survive whatever had driven her family onto the road. "You opened your gate, Silas. That was an act of faith, whether you call it that or not." She left him with the rosary and his thoughts, both of which felt heavier than they should. That afternoon, a storm rolled in, not the gentle rain they all hoped for, but a violent summer squall that turned the sky bruised and angry. Everyone scrambled for shelter, and Silas found himself directing traffic like a general organizing troops. "Get the children in the barn. Daniel, that loose board on the roof, secure it now. Jose, help me with the horses." They worked together in the driving rain, Silas moving with purpose he hadn't felt in years. The horses were spooked by thunder, and it took 3 men to get Copperfield into his stall. Sable kicked at the lightning, ears pinned back, until Maria started singing to her in Spanish, something low and soothing that worked better than any rope. When the storm passed and the sky cleared, they emerged to find minor damage. Some supplies had gotten wet, a section of fence had blown down. One of the vehicles had a tree branch through its windshield. But everyone was safe, and somehow that felt like a victory. They spent the evening drying things out, making repairs, telling stories about other storms in other places. Silas listened more than he talked, learning that Miguel wanted to be an engineer, that Carmen had been a nurse before the drought, that Daniel's father had taught him carpentry in addition to carving because a man should always have more skills than he needs. Anna, the little girl with the gap-toothed smile, approached Silas while he was checking the horses one final time. She held up a picture she'd drawn crude stick figures in crayon, but the intent was clear. A house, a barn, horses, and lots of people standing together under a sun that took up half the sky. "That's you," she said, pointing to a figure that was slightly apart from the others. "You're part of the picture now." Silas took the drawing, felt his throat tighten. "Can I keep this?" "It's for you," Anna said, as if that were obvious. Then she ran off to join the other children who were catching the last rays of sunlight before bed. That night, Silas hung Anna's drawing on his refrigerator with a magnet, the first decoration his house had seen in 2 decades. He set Rosa's rosary on the mantel next to the tobacco tin, and he placed the carved horse on the kitchen windowsill where he'd see it every morning while making coffee. 3 gifts in 1 week. 3 gestures of inclusion from people who owed him nothing and had little to give. The weight of their kindness felt almost unbearable, like learning to use a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. He lay in bed that night listening to the sounds of 32 other heartbeats settling into sleep across his property. The loneliness that had been his constant companion felt somehow lighter, as if sharing his space had divided rather than multiplied the burden. Outside, the storm-cleared sky revealed more stars than he'd seen in months. Somewhere in the barn, a baby cried and was quickly soothed. Someone laughed. A dog barked. When had they gotten a dog? And was shushed quiet. Silas closed his eyes and thought about Sarah, about the children they'd never had, about the family he'd never built. Then he thought about the family that had shown up at his gate, carrying nothing but hope and determination. Maybe, he thought before sleep took him, maybe this was what resurrection looked like. Not dramatic, not immediate, just small acts of kindness, repeated until they became habit, until they became home. The second week brought the kind of heat that made mirages dance on the horizon and tempers flare like struck matches. The well pump broke on a Tuesday. Jose spent 4 hours in the sun trying to fix it, while everyone rationed what water they had left. Children cried from thirst. Tensions rose. By the time Jose got it working again, 2 families were arguing about who'd used more than their share, and Maria had to step between them like a referee. Silas watched it all from the porch, recognizing the pattern. This was what happened when resources got scarce. People turned on each other, forgot they were supposed to be helping each other. He'd seen it before. In those years he didn't talk about, and it never ended well, without intervention. "Enough," he said, not loudly, but with enough authority that everyone stopped. "We've got water now. We'll manage the rationing better tomorrow. Tonight, everybody drinks their fill and cools down their heads and their tempers both." Daniel caught his eye across the yard, nodded slightly. "Thank you," the gesture said. Later, after things had settled, he told Silas, "You're good at that, knowing when to step in." "Practice," Silas said shortly, not wanting to explain where that practice had come from. But the damage was done. The argument had revealed cracks in the collective goodwill, resentments about who worked harder, who got more shade, whose children were louder. Small things, but small things could split communities wide open if left to fester. That evening, Maria organized a meeting in the barn. She stood on a hay bale like a politician on a soapbox and laid down the law with the kind of maternal authority that brooked no argument. "We're tired, we're hot, we're scared about what comes next, but we don't turn on each other. That's not who we are, and it's not who we're going to become. We share what we have. We work together. And when someone is struggling, we help instead of judge. Are we clear?" There were nods, murmured agreements, a few sheepish apologies. Maria had that effect. She could make grown men feel like schoolchildren caught misbehaving, but in a way that made them want to do better rather than rebel. Afterward, she found Silas in the corral, brushing down Buck. "Thank you for stepping in today," she said. "Daniel's a good man, but sometimes he's too patient for his own good. Lets things go too long before he acts." "He's keeping 31 other people alive," Silas said. "That's not easy." "No. Neither is keeping yourself alive when you'd rather not." She leaned against the fence, studying him. "You've been alone a long time, but you're not anymore. That's going to take some adjusting, for you and for us." "I'm adjusting," Silas said defensively. "You're tolerating," Maria corrected gently. "There's a difference. Tolerating is letting us be here. Adjusting is letting us be part of your life." She left him with that thought, and Silas continued brushing Buck with more force than necessary, irritated because she was right. The third artifact came from an unexpected source. Miguel, Daniel's 16-year-old son, who'd been watching Silas with the careful assessment of a young man trying to figure out what kind of man he wanted to become. Silas found it in the barn where he was checking on a loose board. A knife, hand-forged, with a handle wrapped in leather, and a blade that caught the light like captured lightning. It lay on a workbench with another note. "My grandfather made this. He said a good knife is a good friend. Reliable, honest, useful. Thought you might need a friend." Miguel, Silas tested the edge, found it sharp enough to split paper. The balance was perfect, the craftsmanship evident in every detail. This was the kind of knife that got passed down through generations, and Miguel had given it to him. He found the boy working with José on one of the trucks, both of them covered in grease, troubleshooting an engine that had more rust than metal. Miguel, the boy straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans. "Sir, this knife, your grandfather made it?" "Yes, sir. He was a blacksmith in Mexico before we came north. Taught me some, but I never got good enough to make anything like that." "It's a generous gift," Silas said carefully. "Maybe too generous." Miguel shook his head. "My grandfather gave it to me before he died, said I should give it to someone who'd taught me something important." He met Silas's eyes. "You taught me that it's okay to be quiet, that you don't have to fill every silence with words to prove you matter." Silas felt something twist in his chest. "I didn't teach you anything." "You did, though. By example." Miguel smiled, a young man's smile still figuring out its shape. "My dad talks all the time. He's good at it, brings people together, but sometimes I need the quiet. You showed me that's okay, that there's strength in silence, too." After Miguel returned to the engine, Silas sat in the barn, holding the knife and thinking about inheritance, what we pass down, what we receive, how gifts move through time carrying meaning we don't always understand until later. He thought about his own father, who'd been a hard man with rough hands and few words. Thought about how he'd rejected that silence, pursued Sarah's laughter and light instead. But after she died, the silence had crept back in, and he'd worn it like armor. Maybe there was a balance. Maybe you could be quiet without being closed. Maybe you could find peace in silence without using it as a weapon against connection. That night, the families gathered for dinner, a communal affair now, with everyone contributing what they had. Someone had managed to catch fish in the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. Someone else had found wild herbs. The women made tortillas, and the smell filled the evening air like a blessing. Rosa asked Silas to sit with them instead of taking his plate back to the porch. He wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain that boundary. But Maria was watching, and Anna had saved him a spot next to her, and somehow his feet carried him to the circle before his mind could object. They ate together as the sun set, passing food and stories in equal measure. Someone told a joke that made everyone laugh. The baby, Elena, fell asleep in Carmen's arms. The dog, a scruffy mutt named Cisco, who'd apparently been adopted somewhere along the road, lay at Silas's feet like they'd been friends for years. Anna leaned against his shoulder, full and content. "This is nice," she said. "Like a real family." "What do you mean, like?" Rosa asked. "This is a real family. Family isn't just blood, it's who you choose to share your life with." Silas looked around the circle at faces that had been strangers 2 weeks ago, at children who'd found joy despite everything, at adults who'd kept their dignity through hardships that would have broken lesser people. He thought about the 3 gifts on his mantel and windowsill, about how kindness could accumulate like interest on a debt you didn't know you owed. "My wife would have liked this," he said quietly. The words surprised him. He hadn't spoken about Sarah to anyone in 20 years. "Tell us about her," Maria said, and somehow it wasn't an invasion, it was an invitation. So Silas did. He told them about Sarah's laugh, about her terrible cooking when they first married, about how she could find stories in everything. He told them about their 3 years together, and even though the ending was sad, the telling felt like a gift, like taking something that had been locked in darkness and letting it breathe in the light. When he finished, there were tears on some faces, but they were good tears, understanding tears. Anna squeezed his hand. "She sounds nice," the little girl said. "I bet she's glad you're not alone anymore." Silas nodded, because he couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. But later, lying in bed with the window open to the night sounds, he thought that maybe Anna was right. Maybe Sarah would be glad. Maybe all of this, was exactly what she would have wanted for him. 3 weeks in, Silas woke before dawn to find Daniel already awake, standing at the fence line, staring toward Redemption Falls in the pre-dawn grey. "Couldn't sleep?" Silas joined him, 2 coffee cups in hand, a gesture that had become routine. "Thinking about permanence," Daniel said, accepting the cup. We can't stay here forever, Silas. We both know that. But where do we go? Every town between here and California said no. Do we go back east? Try north? Or do we just keep moving until we fall off the edge of the map? Silas had been wondering the same thing, though he'd avoided asking. Having them here had been temporary from the start, but temporary was starting to feel more complicated than he'd expected. What about Redemption Falls? The words came out before he'd fully thought them through. Daniel looked at him. The ghost town? It's not all gone. Church still has good bones, so do some of the houses. Main Street buildings might be salvageable with work. Silas gestured toward the dying town. Nobody's there to say no. Nobody owns it anymore. The bank foreclosed years ago, and they never did anything with it. You're suggesting squatting? I'm suggesting homesteading. There's a difference. Silas took a long drink of coffee. This land, my land, it extends right up to the town border. If you rebuilt Redemption Falls, you'd be my neighbors. Legal neighbors, eventually, if we did it right. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. That's a big offer, a permanent offer. Maybe I'm tired of temporary, Silas admitted. Maybe having 32 heartbeats on my property taught me that silence isn't the same as peace. Let me talk to the others, Daniel said. But Silas, if we did this, it would change everything. We'd need supplies, tools, seed for planting. It would take years to make Redemption Falls livable again. I've got years, Silas said. And apparently, so do you. The fourth artifact appeared that afternoon, brought by Carmen while Silas was repairing a section of fence. She carried baby Elena on her hip, the infant's eyes bright despite the heat. I wanted to give you this, Carmen said, holding out a small leather journal. Before we left our home, I grabbed what I could. This was my abuela's, my grandmother's. She kept recipes, remedies, wisdom. I thought maybe you'd want to add your own memories, so they don't get lost. Silas opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with handwriting in Spanish, with sketches of plants and careful notes in the margins. It was a life's worth of knowledge, preserved in ink and faith. Carmen, this is your family's, and your family now, she interrupted firmly. That's what Maria keeps saying, and she's right. Family shares, family preserves. Family makes sure the important things don't disappear. She left him holding the journal, and Silas stood there, feeling the weight of yet another gift he didn't deserve, but was beginning to understand he needed. That evening, Daniel called everyone together. He stood in front of the barn, Maria beside him, and laid out the possibility of rebuilding Redemption Falls. The response was immediate and mixed excitement from some, skepticism from others, fear from those who'd been disappointed too many times to trust in futures. It would be hard, Daniel acknowledged. Harder than anything we've done, but we'd be building something real, something that lasts, something we own, that nobody can take away or turn us away from. What about Silas? Jose asked. This is his land, his idea, but what does he get out of it? Everyone turned to look at him, and Silas felt the weight of 32 pairs of eyes. I get neighbors, he said simply. I get a reason to fix up this ranch beyond just keeping busy. I get, he paused, searching for words that didn't come easy, I get to stop living in the past. And maybe that's worth more than keeping 200 acres to myself. Rosa stood, her teacher's posture commanding attention. Then we vote. All adults. Do we try to rebuild Redemption Falls, or do we keep moving? The vote was unanimous. They would stay, they would build, they would take this ghost town and breathe life back into it, one board and nail at a time. The celebration that night was subdued but real. Someone played guitar. The children danced in the firelight. Plans were made, dreams were spoken aloud, and for the first time since arriving, everyone's eyes looked forward instead of back. Silas watched from the porch, the leather journal in his hands, thinking about the weight of the decision they'd all just made. This wasn't charity anymore. This wasn't temporary shelter. This was commitment to each other, to the land, to a future that didn't yet exist but might, if they worked hard enough. Miguel sat down beside him, a bottle of soda in hand. You really think we can do this? Make a whole town live again? I've seen harder things accomplished with less, Silas said, thinking of missions completed, objectives achieved, impossible odds overcome. The question isn't whether you can, it's whether you will. When things get hard, when winter comes and the work is brutal, when people start fighting about who has what, will you keep going? Will you? Miguel challenged, young enough to be bold. I think I already decided to keep going when I opened that gate, Silas said. Everything since then has just been figuring out what that means. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Silas walked to the cottonwood tree where Sarah was buried. He hadn't visited in weeks, too busy with the demands of 32 extra lives on his property. The grave was simple, a wooden cross he'd carved himself, her name and dates, nothing elaborate. I'm going to do it, he told her, or told the night, or told himself. I'm going to help them rebuild. I'm going to let go of this place being a monument to grief and let it be something alive again. The wind rustled the cottonwood leaves, and in that sound he heard neither approval nor condemnation, just the wind doing what wind does. I loved you, he continued. I'll always love to you. But Anna was right. You'd be glad I'm not alone anymore. You'd probably have adopted all of them within an hour and been making plans to rebuild the whole county. He smiled at the thought, and it didn't hurt as much as it usually did. So I'm doing it for you too, for the children we didn't get to have, for the family we wanted to build. It's just happening differently than we planned. He touched the cross, felt the weathered wood under his palm, and then turned back toward the house, toward the barn, full of people, toward the future that scared him more than loneliness ever had, but felt more right than anything had in 20 years. In the morning, they would start. They would walk to Redemption Falls with tools and hope and determination. They would assess what could be saved and what needed to be rebuilt from scratch. They would begin the slow, difficult work of resurrection. But tonight, Silas stood under a sky full of stars, holding Carmen's grandmother's journal, and allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, dead things could come back to life if you gave them enough care and attention and love. The ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not empty, not abandoned, just resting, gathering strength for the work ahead. The surveyor arrived on a Thursday afternoon, driving a county vehicle with official plates and carrying a clipboard that spelled trouble before he even opened his mouth. Silas was in town, the real town, 40 miles away, picking up supplies for the Redemption Falls rebuild when the man showed up. By the time he got back, Daniel was waiting at the gate with the kind of expression that meant bad news couldn't be delayed. County sent someone, Daniel said, without preamble. Said they got a report about unauthorized occupation of condemned property. They want to know who gave us permission to be on your land and why we're planning to rebuild a town that was officially abandoned and condemned. Silas felt cold despite the heat. What did you tell them? That we had your permission for the ranch. Didn't mention Redemption Falls. Figured that was your story to tell. Daniel paused. Silas, the man said something else. Said there's been interest in this area. Some company looking at the land for development. They've been buying up abandoned properties, including Redemption Falls. When, he wouldn't say. Just that we might want to make other arrangements. That night, Silas drove into the real town and made some calls. What he learned confirmed his worst fears. A development company had purchased the rights to Redemption Falls 6 months ago for taxes owed. They were planning something, though the details weren't public yet. And now, someone had reported the family's presence, probably hoping to clear the area before whatever development began. He sat in a diner booth at midnight, coffee cold in front of him, and faced a truth he'd been avoiding for 20 years. Running away didn't solve problems, it just delayed them. The 5th artifact appeared the next morning, but this one he placed himself. Silas gathered everyone in the barn, all 32 of them, children included. He stood where Daniel usually stood, feeling exposed in a way he hadn't since before the isolation. There's something I need to tell you, he began, and saw Maria's eyes sharpen with concern. "About why I've been alone out here for 20 years, and what that means for what we're trying to build." He pulled out the artifact, his old military ID card, worn and faded but still clearly showing a younger version of himself. "Master Sergeant Silas Wren, U.S. Army Special Forces." Beneath it, a citation for valor, and beneath that, a photograph he'd kept hidden for 2 decades, himself, in uniform, with his unit, faces of men he'd served with, most of whom hadn't made it home. "I wasn't just a farmer before Sarah," he said quietly. "I spent 12 years in the military, most of it in places we weren't officially supposed to be, doing things I can't talk about even now. I was good at it, too good maybe. I followed orders, completed missions, believed I was serving a purpose." He could feel 32 pairs of eyes on him, but he kept going. "Then I came home and met Sarah, and I thought I could leave all that behind, build something clean and good. But the things I'd done, they don't wash off easy. And when she died, when the baby died, I took it as judgment, divine justice. I'd taken lives, so the universe took the lives I loved most." Rosa's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet barn. "I isolated myself because I believed I deserved it, believed I was dangerous to be around, that anyone who got close would be punished for my sins." He looked around at the faces, watching him, some shocked, some understanding, all of them listening. "I'm telling you this now because I need you to know who you're dealing with, and because if that development company pushes, I have resources you don't. I have training. I know how to fight." "Fight?" Maria's voice was sharp. "Silas, we're not asking you to go to war for us." "I'm not going to war," he said. "But I'm not going to let you get pushed out either. I've spent 20 years running from who I was. Maybe it's time I use those skills for something that actually matters." Daniel stood slowly. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we fight this legally first. I have money saved, 20 years of military pension I've barely touched. We use it to hire a lawyer, contest the sale, establish squatters' rights, whatever it takes. And if legal doesn't work," he paused, "if legal doesn't work, we make it very expensive and very complicated for them to develop this land. We delay, we obstruct, we make sure every permit takes months and every inspection finds problems. That's still your war training talking." Rosa said softly. "Yes," Silas admitted, "but this time I'd be fighting. For something worth protecting. For people worth protecting. That's the difference." Miguel stood up, the knife his grandfather made visible at his belt. "Then we fight together. You're not alone anymore, Silas. None of us are." One by one the others stood. Daniel, Maria, Jose, Carmen with baby Elena, Rosa with her teacher's determination. The teenagers trying to look brave, even little Anna, who probably didn't understand half of what was being discussed, but understood that her family was standing together. Silas felt something shift in his chest, that same tectonic movement from the day he'd opened the gate, but deeper now. These people weren't just accepting his help anymore. They were offering theirs. They were saying that his past didn't define his worth, that redemption was something you built through action, not something you earned through suffering. "There's one more thing," he said, and this was the hardest part. "My isolation, it wasn't just about guilt, it was about fear. Fear that if I let people in, I'd lose them like I lost Sarah. That I'd care about something again, and caring would give the universe another weapon to use against me." "And now?" Rosa asked gently. "Now I'm terrified," Silas said honestly, "because I do care. About all of you. About Redemption Falls. About whether Anna gets to grow up in a place she can call home. And that fear is bigger than anything I faced in combat." "Fear means you're alive," Daniel said. "Means what you're fighting for matters." Maria walked over and took the military ID from Silas's hand, studied it, then handed it back. "This is part of who you are. But it's not all of who you are. We've seen who you are for 3 weeks now. A man who opens gates when he could close them, who shares what he has, who's learning to live again after a long time of just existing. We're not afraid of your past," Jose added. "We're grateful for your present." Carmen touched his arm. "You gave us hope when we had none. Let us give you something back, permission to forgive yourself." Silas looked around at these people who'd become family without him, quite noticing when it happened. At the children who'd brought laughter back to his land. At the adults who'd taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness and that community wasn't a burden to be carried alone. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, we fight. Together. We save Redemption Falls, and we build something that lasts. But if it gets dangerous, then we face danger together," Daniel interrupted. "That's what family does." That night, Silas added the military ID to the collection on his mantle next to Sarah's ring, the carved horse, Rosa's rosary, Miguel's knife, and Carmen's grandmother's journal. 5 artifacts of a life being rebuilt, piece by piece, memory by memory, connection by connection. He stood there looking at them and thought about the weight of the past versus the weight of the future. The past was heavy, but it was fixed, unchangeable. The future was heavy too, but it was alive with possibility. He chose the future, chose these people, chose to be the kind of man who fought for what mattered instead of hiding from what hurt. In the morning, they would hire a lawyer. They would research property law. They would begin the complicated, difficult work of establishing legal claim to Redemption Falls. And if that didn't work, well, Silas had 12 years of training in achieving objectives against impossible odds. He'd never fought for anything that mattered this much. And that, somehow, made all the difference. The lawyer's name was Margaret Chen, and she'd seen enough land grabs to recognize one when it was explained to her. She sat across from Silas in her office, glasses perched on her nose, reviewing documents with the kind of focused intensity that reminded him of mission briefings. "They purchased the rights to Redemption Falls for back taxes," she said. "That's legal. But—" She looked up, and Silas saw the hint of a smile. "They didn't purchase your land, and your property line extends right to the town border. More importantly, several of the buildings in Redemption Falls are actually on disputed boundary land that was never properly surveyed when the town was incorporated. Meaning, if we can prove continuous use and improvement of that land, we might be able to establish adverse possession claims. It's a long shot, but it's something." She leaned back. "However, they have deeper pockets and can drag this out for years. The question is, can your families survive that kind of legal battle?" Silas thought about 32 people living in a barn and a bunkhouse, about children who needed stability, about adults who'd been running too long. "We'll have to. What do we need to do? Document everything. Photograph every improvement you make. Keep records of who's living where and doing what. Make it clear that Redemption Falls isn't abandoned, it's being actively reclaimed. And pray that the judge we draw is sympathetic to homesteaders over corporate interests." Over the next week, they worked like soldiers preparing for deployment. Daniel organized teams. Jose surveyed the town buildings, documenting what was salvageable. Rosa started a detailed ledger of every person, every skill, every contribution. Maria coordinated supplies with military efficiency that would have impressed Silas's old commanders. Silas himself did what he did best, strategic planning. He mapped the town, identified choke points, documented access roads, noted which buildings were structurally sound enough to defend if it came to that. Old habits resurging, but purposeful now instead of haunted. The 6th artifact emerged from this, planning a hand-drawn map of Redemption Falls with detailed notes in multiple handwritings. Silas had started it, but others had added to it. Daniel's carpentry assessments, Rosa's notes on which buildings could be school, clinic, community center, Jose's mechanical observations about water systems and power potential. It was a collaborative vision of what they could build together. Miguel found Silas studying the map late one night. "You really think we can pull this off? I've seen insurgent cells hold territory against entire armies with nothing but determination and knowledge of local terrain," Silas said. "We've got more than that. We've got right on our side. Right doesn't always win." "No," Silas admitted, "but wrong doesn't always win either." Sometimes it comes down to who's willing to fight longest. The development company made their first official move 2 weeks after the lawyer was hired. A cease and desist letter delivered by courier, demanding that all unauthorized persons vacate the property within 30 days or face legal action. Margaret's response was immediate, a counterclaim establishing the family's rights to the disputed boundary land, along with a motion for injunction preventing any development until the property lines were properly surveyed. The legal battle had begun, but the company didn't stop at legal measures. A week after the counterclaim, strangers started appearing at the ranch, men in suits taking photographs, asking questions of anyone they could corner, making notes on clipboards. One tried to interview Anna, offering her candy for information about who was living where. Maria intercepted before any harm was done, but the message was clear. They were being investigated, documented, probably looking for any violation that could be used against them. "They're trying to intimidate us," Daniel said at an emergency meeting. "Trying to make us uncomfortable enough to leave voluntarily. Then we don't leave," Maria said firmly. "We document them right back. Every visit, every question, every attempt at intimidation goes in our records. 2 can play at documentation." Silas felt pride swell in his chest. These people had been pushed around for months, maybe years, but they weren't backing down. They were learning to fight back, not with violence but with determination and solidarity. The real turning point came on a Tuesday morning when 3 county vehicles pulled up, not surveyors this time, but building inspectors. They had warrants to inspect every structure on Silas's property, looking for code violations, unauthorized habitation, anything that could be used as leverage. Silas met them at the gate, and for the first time in 20 years he let himself be the master sergeant again, not in anger, but in command presence. "Gentlemen, I assume you have proper warrants for each building you intend to inspect." The lead inspector, a man named Henderson with a bureaucrat's careful neutrality, handed over the paperwork. Silas reviewed each page, noted the specific buildings listed, and then smiled. "The barn, the bunkhouse, and my primary residence. That's what your warrants cover. Not the structures in redemption, falls that are on disputed boundary land. Not the new construction my workers," he emphasized the word, "are building as part of their employment on my ranch. Just these 3 buildings." Henderson's jaw tightened. "Mr. Wren, we have reason to believe—" "I don't care what you believe. You have warrants for 3 structures. You're welcome to inspect those 3 structures. If you attempt to go beyond your legal authority, I'll have my lawyer on the phone before you take 3 steps, and your warrant will be challenged so fast it'll make your head spin." They inspected the 3 buildings, found nothing substantially wrong. Jose and Daniel had made sure of that, and left with the kind of frustrated silence that said they'd been hoping for more ammunition. After they were gone, Daniel clapped Silas on the shoulder. "That was something to see. You just outmaneuvered them without raising your voice." "I learned a long time ago that the best battles are won before they're fought," Silas said. "Know the rules better than your opponent. Know what they can and can't do. Make their aggression work against them." "You really were military, weren't you?" Jose said with new respect. "I really was, but I'm something else now." Silas looked around at the families watching him, at the children playing near the barn, at the half-rebuilt structures of Redemption Falls visible in the distance. "I'm a man who finally found something worth fighting for." That evening, they held another gathering, not a celebration, but a war council. Everyone over 16 was included, even Miguel and the other teenagers. Silas stood at the front with the map, and he briefed them like soldiers, because in a way, that's what they'd become. "The company will escalate," he said. "They've tried intimidation, they've tried legal inspection. Next will probably be economic pressure, cutting off our supply routes, pressuring businesses not to sell to us, maybe trying to condemn the access road. We need to be prepared for every eventuality." "How do we prepare for economic warfare?" Rosa asked. "Stockpile, garden, make connections with suppliers who won't be easily pressured. And we document everything, every attempt at interference, every threat, every pressure tactic. Build a case that shows a pattern of harassment. What if they succeed? Carmen asked, Elena sleeping against her shoulder. What if the judge rules against us? Then we appeal, Margaret Chen said. She'd started attending their meetings, caught up in their cause. And while we appeal, we keep building, keep improving, keep establishing ourselves as a legitimate community. The longer we hold on, the stronger our position becomes. Silas looked around at determined faces, at people who'd been knocked down too many times but kept getting back up. I want you all to understand something. This is going to get harder before it gets better. There will be setbacks. There will be moments when it seems easier to give up and move on. But if we do this, if we see it through, we won't just be saving Redemption Falls. We'll be proving that people still matter more than profits. That community is stronger than corporate interests. That family, even family we choose, is worth fighting for. Then we fight, Daniel said simply. All of us, together. One by one, they voiced agreement. Not with enthusiasm, they were too tired for that, but with determination, with the kind of resolve that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to gain. After the meeting, Anna approached Silas with another drawing. This one showed Redemption Falls, rebuilt houses with smoking chimneys, children playing in streets, a flag flying over what she'd labeled our town. In the center stood a figure she'd clearly marked as Silas, surrounded by all the families. This is what we're fighting for, she said, with the simple certainty of childhood. So we have to win. Silas knelt down to her level. We're going to try our hardest. But Anna, even if we don't win the way we hope, we've already won something important. We've already proven that we're stronger together than apart. But we will win the other way too, Anna insisted, because you're here, and you don't lose. Her faith in him was both humbling and terrifying. He thought about all the missions he had lost, all the objectives that had failed, all the men who hadn't come home. But he also thought about the ones that had succeeded, not because they were certain, but because the people involved refused to give up. Okay, he said to Anna, we'll win, both ways. That night, Silas added her new drawing to his collection, pinning it to the kitchen wall next to the first one. Two visions of the same hope, separated by weeks, but connected by belief that dead things could come back to life if you gave them enough care and attention and love. He stood at his window, looking out at the lit barn, at the families preparing for the fight ahead, at Redemption Falls in the distance, waiting to be brought back from the dead. Tomorrow, they would start the real work, not just of rebuilding, but of defending their right to rebuild. Tomorrow, the battle would begin in earnest. But tonight, surrounded by artifacts of a life being reconstructed, Silas allowed himself to believe they could actually win. Not because victory was certain, but because these people had taught him that fighting for what matters is itself a kind of victory, regardless of outcome. He was no longer the man who'd isolated himself in grief. He was no longer even the soldier who'd followed orders without question. He was something new, a man who'd found family in strangers, purpose in struggle, and redemption in the daily choice to keep fighting for something bigger than himself. And that, he realized, was worth more than 200 acres of dust, more than 20 years of solitude, more than any mission he'd completed in those years. He didn't talk about. This was what winning actually looked like. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of people worth struggling alongside. The confrontation came on a Monday morning, 6 weeks after the families had first arrived. Silas was in Redemption Falls with Daniel and Jose, assessing the church building when he heard the vehicles. Not county trucks this time. Private security, 3 SUVs worth, pulling up with the kind of casual authority that comes from knowing the law is technically on your side. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the lead vehicle, late 50s, silver hair, the kind of polished appearance that came from years of closing deals that displaced people. He surveyed Redemption Falls with the cool assessment of someone calculating property value. Silas Wren? His voice carried the easy confidence of a man accustomed to winning. That's right. Silas walked forward, Daniel and Jose flanking him. Behind them, other families had noticed the vehicles and were gathering, not threatening, just present, a show of numbers. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I represent Western Development Corporation. We own this property, Mr. Wren, and you're trespassing." "Actually, you own some of this property," Silas corrected. "The boundary lines are under dispute, and we've filed legal claims on the structures we've improved. My lawyer can provide you with all the documentation." Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your lawyer is creative. I'll give her that. But creativity doesn't change reality. We have plans for this land, plans that will bring jobs, revenue, economic development to this area. Your little homesteading project is standing in the way of progress." "Progress?" Daniel's voice was hard. "Is that what you call pushing families out? Condemning land so you can build whatever makes you the most profit? I call it development. I call it making use of abandoned resources." Caldwell's gaze swept over the gathered families. "Look, I'm not unsympathetic. You've clearly put work into this, so I'm prepared to make a one-time offer. $20,000, split among your families. Enough to relocate somewhere with actual opportunity. You take the money, you leave peacefully, and everyone wins." "Except we'd still be homeless," Maria called out. "Still be moving from place to place, still be families nobody wants." "That's not my problem," Caldwell said. And there it was, the casual cruelty that came from viewing people as obstacles rather than human beings. "My problem is that you're squatting on property I own. My offer is generous. Take it before it disappears." Silas felt the families behind him, felt their fear and anger and determination. He thought about Anna's drawings, about Miguel's knife, about all the small acts of kindness that had rebuilt not just structures, but souls. He thought about the man he'd been following orders, accepting that some people were acceptable losses in service of larger objectives. And he thought about the man he'd become, who understood that the largest objective was protecting the people who mattered. "No," he said simply. Caldwell's expression hardened. "Excuse me? No, we're not taking your money. We're not leaving. This is our home now, and you'll have to drag us out legally or not at all." "That can be arranged," Caldwell said coldly. "I have a court order authorizing us to secure this property. You have until this evening to remove your personal belongings. After that, anything left behind will be considered abandoned." He pulled out a document, waved it like a weapon. Margaret Chen appeared at Silas's elbow. She'd been monitoring from her car, knowing this confrontation was coming. "That order applies only to structures you have clear title to," she said calmly, taking the document and reviewing it. "Which, according to our filings and the pending survey, doesn't include most of what you're looking at. Try to enforce this before the boundary dispute is resolved, and I'll have an injunction filed within the hour." The judge is Judge Morrison, who has a documented history of ruling in favor of adverse possession claims when continuous improvement can be demonstrated. Margaret smiled. "We've done our homework, Mr. Caldwell. You're not bulldozing anything today." Caldwell's face flushed red. "This is harassment. I'll have all of you arrested for—" "For what?" Silas interrupted, and his voice carried the command presence of his military years. "For improving abandoned property? For establishing residence on disputed land? For exercising our legal rights to due process? You can try, but before you do, understand something. I've spent 12 years learning how to fight people who had more resources, more weapons, more support than we did. I learned how to win anyway. This isn't combat, Mr. Caldwell, but it is a fight, and I guarantee you're not prepared for how long we can make this last." Caldwell stared at him, recognition dawning. "You're military, was military. Now I'm just a man protecting his family." Silas gestured at the people behind him. "All of them. And I'm very good at protection." The two men stood facing each other, one representing corporate power and legal authority, the other representing something older and more fundamental. The right of people to build homes, to create community, to defend what they'd made with their own hands. "This isn't over," Caldwell said finally. No, Silas agreed. But it's not over the way you think. Caldwell and his security team left, engines roaring like frustrated animals. The families stood in silence, processing what had just happened, understanding that the real battle was just beginning. The next 48 hours were a blur of legal motions, emergency hearings and phone calls. Margaret Chen worked around the clock, filing injunctions, presenting evidence of continuous improvement, arguing that Western development's claim was legally questionable and morally bankrupt. But Silas knew the real battle wasn't being fought in courtrooms, it was being fought in the court of public opinion. And that's where Miguel gave them their winning strategy. "My friend from before," the boy said during an emergency meeting. "He works for a newspaper in the city. What if we told them our story? Not just the legal stuff, but the human stuff. Families that got turned away everywhere finding a home, a ghost town being brought back to life. A veteran using his skills to protect people instead of—" He stopped, but everyone understood. Media attention could cut both ways, Margaret warned. It might pressure the company to back off, or it might make them dig in harder to save face. But it might also bring allies, Rosa said, other people who believe community matters. Other towns that might welcome families like ours if this doesn't work out. Maria looked at Silas. "What do you think?" He thought about all the years he'd hidden, all the time spent believing his story was one of shame rather than potential redemption. He thought about Anna's faith that they would win, about Daniel's carved horse, about 32 people who'd taught him that vulnerability could be strength. "We tell the story," he said. "All of it, the good, the hard, the complicated. We trust that there are enough people out there who still believe in what we're building." Miguel made the call. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret, arrived the next day with a camera operator. She interviewed families, photographed the improvements, documented the before and after of Redemption Falls. When she interviewed Silas, she asked the hard questions about his military service, his isolation, his decision to help. "I spent 20 years punishing myself for being alive when people I loved were dead," he told her honestly. "These families taught me that living well is better than living guilty. That redemption isn't something you achieve alone, it's something you build together." The article ran 3 days later on the front page, not just of the local paper, but picked up by the state wire service. The headline read, "Ghost Town Gets Second Chance, How 10 Families and 1 Veteran Are Fighting Corporate Development." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured in from other veterans, from families who'd faced displacement, from small-town residents who understood what it meant to fight for community against corporate interests. Donations arrived, money, supplies, offers of legal support. A retired surveyor volunteered to conduct an independent boundary assessment. 3 law firms offered pro bono assistance. But the most important response came from Judge Morrison's office, a hearing scheduled for the following week, expedited due to public interest considerations. Both sides would present their cases, and the judge would rule on the boundary dispute and the adverse possession claims. The night before the hearing, Silas couldn't sleep. He stood on his porch looking out at Redemption Falls, where lights now burned in a dozen windows, where children's laughter echoed off buildings that had stood empty for years, where a community had taken root in soil that everyone else had written off as barren. Daniel joined him, 2 coffee cups in hand, their ritual now. "Nervous? Terrified," Silas admitted. "Not of losing the legal battle, of letting them down, of not being able to protect what we've built." "You already protected it," Daniel said, "by teaching us to stand up instead of run, by showing us that we're worth fighting for. Whatever happens tomorrow, that doesn't change." The hearing was standing room only. Western Development brought lawyers, experts, impressive presentations about economic development and property rights. But Margaret brought something more powerful. She brought the families. One by one, they testified. Rosa talked about establishing the school, about children who'd missed months of education finally learning again. Jose described the water system he'd restored, the buildings he'd made safe. Carmen testified about community health initiatives, about a baby who would have died from dehydration if they'd kept moving. And Anna, 7 years old and fierce, told the judge about her drawings, about home, about how some places choose you as much as you choose them. When it was Silas's turn, he kept it simple. 20 years ago, I buried my wife and child and decided I was done being part of the world. These families showed me I was wrong. They showed me that the world needs people who'll fight for each other instead of against each other. This isn't about property rights or economic development. It's about whether we're still the kind of people who make room for everyone or just for whoever has the biggest bank account. Judge Morrison listened to everything, reviewed all the evidence, and took a recess that felt like it lasted forever. When she returned, her expression was unreadable. I've reviewed the surveys, the historical records, and the testimony, she said. The boundary dispute is legitimate. The adverse possession claims show clear evidence of continuous improvement and good faith occupation. While Western Development Corporation has legal purchase of portions of Redemption Falls, they do not have clear title to the disputed areas, and their claim is superseded by adverse possession laws. She paused, looking directly at Caldwell. Furthermore, I'm ruling that any development in this area must include impact assessments for current residents and cannot proceed until boundary lines are definitively established, a process that will take at minimum 6 months. The Send courtroom erupted. Maria grabbed Silas's hand. Daniel lifted Miguel off his feet. Rosa closed her eyes and whispered prayers of thanks. Anna jumped up and down, not entirely understanding the legal language, but knowing from everyone's reactions that they'd won. They'd won. 6 months later, Silas Wren stood at the fence line watching the sun rise over Redemption Falls, and nothing looked the same. The ghost town had a heartbeat again. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children walked to school in the converted building that Rosa ran, with the help of 2 mothers who'd been teachers before the drought. The church had been restored, its steeple straightened, its bell ringing every Sunday morning. Main Street had 4 occupied buildings, a general store run by the Martinez family, Jose's mechanic shop, a small clinic where Carmen used her nursing skills, and a community center that served as everything from town hall to social gathering space. It wasn't finished, probably never would be, not completely, but it was alive. Daniel appeared at his elbow, coffee in hand, the morning ritual that had become as reliable as sunrise. Thinking deep thoughts, thinking how different things look when you stop seeing them as endings and start seeing them as beginnings, Silas said. That's borderline poetic. Sarah would be proud. Silas smiled. He talked about Sarah openly now, shared memories without drowning in grief. Her ring still sat in the tobacco tin on his mantel, but it had company all the artifacts that represented his new life. The carved horse, Rosa's rosary, Miguel's knife, Carmen's journal, Anna's drawings. And new additions, a deed showing the boundary settlement, a photograph of all 32 people standing in front of the restored church, a wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Redemption Falls, population growing." Judge Morrison finalized the boundary settlement yesterday, Daniel said. Margaret called. The disputed land is officially ours through adverse possession. Western Development dropped their appeal. They found easier targets, Silas said. It wasn't satisfaction, just recognition. Caldwell and his company would find another ghost town, other families to displace. But not these families, not this town. We're incorporated now, Daniel continued. Official town status, which means we need a mayor. Council's unanimous, they want you. No, Silas shook his head. I'm not a politician. I'm barely a social person. You're a leader, Daniel corrected. You taught us to fight for ourselves. That's what mayors do. They lead, they protect, they make sure everyone's voice matters. Then you do it. You're better with people. I'll do it, Daniel agreed. If you'll be my deputy. Someone's got to keep me honest, Silas considered, then nodded. It felt right, shared leadership, shared responsibility, not one man carrying everything alone. They walked into town together, past houses being rebuilt, past gardens growing in what had been hardpan, past the cottonwood tree where Sarah rested. Someone had planted flowers there. Anna and Tomas, probably, who visited regularly to tell Sarah about their day. It had become a memorial not to death, but to the life that had grown from loss. The morning brought its usual rhythm. Rosa's school bell rang. Jose's mechanic shop opened with the clang of tools and the hum of conversation. Maria organized the community center for that evening's planning meeting. They were discussing water infrastructure for the eastern side of town. Miguel worked with his father on house construction, his carpentry skills improving daily under Daniel's patient instruction. Anna found Silas near the church, her brother Tomas in tow. The boy's lungs were stronger now, benefiting from stable housing and regular meals, and the kind of security that lets bodies heal. "Mr. Silas, look." Anna held up a seedling in a small pot. "I grew it from the seeds Rosa gave us. She says it'll be a tree someday, a big one. Where are you going to plant it?" Silas asked, kneeling to her level. "Here," Anna said, pointing to a spot near the church. "So everyone can see it grow. So when we're old like you, we can remember when Redemption Falls came back to life." "I'm not that old," Silas protested, but he was smiling. "You're old enough to be wise," Anna said seriously. "That's what Rosa says. She says some people get old and just get angry, but you got old and got kind instead." Silas felt his throat tighten. "I had good teachers. They planted the tree together. Anna and Tomas and Silas, patting down earth and watering it carefully. A small ceremony for a small tree that would outlive them all if they tended it properly. Just like community," Silas thought, "just like family. Small acts of care, repeated until they became forests." That evening, Silas sat on his porch, the same porch where he'd spent 20 years alone. But now he could hear the town in the distance. Laughter, music, the sounds of people living rather than merely surviving. The final artifact appeared that night, though he made it himself. Using skills Daniel had taught him, because even at 65, even after 12 years of military training and 20 years of isolation, there were still things to learn. Silas carved a small wooden figure. It was rough, nowhere near Daniel's skill level, but recognizable. A man opening a gate, arms wide, welcoming. He placed it on the mantel with all the others, this collection of moments that told the story of a man learning to live again, learning that isolation wasn't safety and silence wasn't peace, learning that family could be chosen and home could be built, and redemption was something you practiced daily rather than achieved once. He thought about the hook that had started all of this, 32 desperate people showing up at a closed gate, hoping for kindness from a stranger who'd forgotten how to be kind. And he thought about everything that had grown from that moment when fear almost won, but choice prevailed. Sometimes the loneliest hearts do have the most room left to give, but only if they're willing to open the gate. Only if they're willing to let resurrection happen not all at once, but in small daily decisions, to choose connection over isolation, to choose community over safety, to choose life over the comfortable numbness of grief. The sun set over Redemption Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that Sarah would have loved. Somewhere in town, a baby cried and was soothed. Children laughed. Adults made plans for tomorrow and next week and next year. A dog barked, a guitar played. Life, in all its messy, beautiful, complicated glory, continued. And Silas Wren, who'd spent 20 years preparing for nothing, went to bed that night, preparing for everything, for town meetings and school plays and arguments about water rights and harvest festivals and all the ordinary miracles that come from people building something together that none of them could build alone. The ranch wasn't empty anymore, neither was he, and that finally was exactly as it should be.